that today's daf is daf Vav. We're going to start at daf Hey on Beis, and we're going to review the statement of Rav, which is quoted approximately 8 lines before the end of daf Hey on Beis, because we won't understand daf Vav unless we review daf Hey on Beis, the statement of Rav, Rav Chia, in the name of Rav. Shiurim, Hatzitzim, Umechitzim, Halacha L'Moshe Misina. These are 3 categories, which Rav claims are all derived through the oral transmission dating back to Moshe Rabbeinu, unbroken chain. We're going to focus our attention today mostly on Shiurim. And the Gemara is going to raise the following question. Shiurim do'oraisa, how can you tell me that we derive Shiurim through Halacha L'Moshe Sinai? We derive it from the Torah itself. The Ksiv, in the parsha of Shevach, Eretz Yisrael, in the 8th chapter of Dvarim, it says, Eretz Chito Sora, etc., etc. Every word in this pasuk is a reference to a different shiur, a minimum amount for, as we'll see, in each case respectively. Now, this is a Shevach of Eretz Yisrael, even though it's true that these shiurim are relevant all over the world, but the fact that the Torah chose the fruits of Eretz Yisrael to transmit Torah, anything that is used as a method or a conduit to teach Torah gets sanctified. It's a special sanctity that we derive the shiurim from each one of these fruits. And now we're going to go through in great detail all of Rav Chanin's derivations from each one of the fruits. And at the end of the day, this is going to prove that shiurim are doraisa, they're derived from the Torah itself, not from Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. And on the side, I would just comment that there are halachic differences between a doraisa and a Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. Like, for example, orla in Chutz La'aretz is only Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. It does not have the exact same status as orla in Eretz Yisrael. Chita, the first on the list is Chita, Lebeis HaMenuga. The Torah tells us that after a long process, when the Kohen finally declares that this bias is contaminated with Tumas Beis HaMenugim, and this entire tractate in the Mishnah is called Masechet Negoim, then if a person enters into a Beis HaMenuga, the Beis HaMenuga, this house that's contaminated, has the status of an Avatuma. That means it's Metame Adam V'Kelim. And the other V'Kelim that enter into this Beis HaMenuga have the status of what's called a Rishon L'Tuma, and they can transmit and convey Tuma to make a Sheni L'Tuma. However, the Torah makes the following distinction, that if the person that enters into the Beis HaMenuga is holding on to Kelim, he's carrying them, then they become Tmeim immediately when he enters into the Beis HaMenuga. However, the Torah tells us that Hashochev Babayis Yichabes Es Begodav, that's in Vayikra Perek Yud Daled, and Ha'ochel Babayis Yichabes Es Begodav. Now, why does the Torah speak about sleeping and eating in the house? The very moment he enters into the house, we derive from this pasuk that with regard to Kelim that he's wearing on his body, not that he's carrying in his hand, those do not immediately become tummy when he enters into the Beis HaMenuga. Yischanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, in the 13th parak of Masechet Negoim, Hanichnas leBeis HaMenuga v'Kelav al Ksefav, if he's holding on to his clothing, let's say, for example, he has a folded up t-shirt, which he's carrying on his shoulders, or a sandalov, he's carrying in his hand, his shoes, or tabaosov, his rings, he's not wearing them. Then hu v'hem nitmoim biyad, they all, he himself plus the kelim that he's carrying into the Beis HaMenuga, immediately contracted tumah of a Rishon L'Tumah. And here we turn to the Vav, which is our daf for today. But Hoyalav, which Kelim, if he's not carrying the kelim, but rather he's wearing the kelim, and to some extent, when he's wearing the kelim are batel to his body. They're like part of his body, and we've discussed this in the past. me and Mendel about Caleb being part of the body, Lavush, or Sandal Baraglov. Now he's not carrying his shoes, he's wearing his shoes. Or Sabaosov, Etzbaosov, he has his rings around his finger. Then who, Tome Miyad, he and any Caleb that he's carrying into the Beis Hamnuga immediately contract Tumah. As we said before, they become a Rishon L'Tumah. Behain, however, the Kalim, the Levush, the Sandalim, the Tabos that he's wearing on his body, Tahorim. However, the Torah says, and again we'll repeat the pasuk, the Torah says, now the Torah is addressing the begadim that he's wearing on his body. And we don't take this pasuk literally, says the Mishnah, that he has to eat in the house, and only after he finishes his meal, then his begadim contract tumah. But rather, as long as he remains in the bias, that's called shehiyah, hidei achilas pras. This is the last thing that we discussed yesterday. This is the amount of time it would take to eat a half a loaf of bread, which is considered mazon su'uda achas. It's a meal. It's the bread for one meal. So if he remains in the house for that period of time that would take to eat one meal, which is called Kidei Achilas Pras, then and only then do the begadim that he's wearing on his body contract tumah. Now, exactly how long of a period of time is Kidei Achilas Pras? Whoa, that is an issue. It varies from about 2 minutes to 9 minutes. The various shitos about what Achilas Pras is, and it's relevant to many, many different halachos. Now, the Mishnah is going to add another stipulation to this shir of shehiyah, which is called Kidei Achilas Pras, because when you talk about a loaf of bread, you could talk about a loaf of wheat bread. You could talk about a loaf of barley bread. Again, I don't know how popular barley bread is. Some tell me it's good for animals, but I don't own any animals, so I don't know. But in any event, the Mishnah says pas chitim velo pas siorim, that the loaf of bread is made of wheat, and that's going to be the shir of Kidei Achilas Pras. And not only that, now the Mishnah talks about how he eats it. Mesiv, he eats it when he sits down and he's not distracted. He really focuses on his meal. He has nothing else on his agenda. But we don't evaluate Kidei Achilas Pras with the time it takes for a person who's standing. And here's the way Rashi interprets this. Rashi says that the halacha here that's formulated by this Mishnah is coming lechumra. What do I mean lechumra? It takes a longer time to eat a pas siorim than it does to eat a pas chitim. So Rashi is learning this Mishnah is shortening the amount of time of Kidei Achilas Pras. Or for example, when a person is standing, then it takes a longer time to eat his meal because, as we said before, he's distracted, he's standing, he goes over here, he talks to his friend. As opposed to Mason, when he sits down, that's a shorter period of time. So the Mishnah is being machmir. And finally, va'olcha b'liftan. Rashi learns that when he eats the bread together with what's called dvarim aboim l'lafis esapas, there are other things that he eats with the pas. Let's say, for example, he dips it in shemen zayis or whatever he does. Hummus, right? He eats it with hummus. Then in those cases, he eats the pas faster. That's Rashi. Again, Tosa has a whole different shita that according to Rashi, we're cutting down the amount of time Tov Kidei Achilas Pras, because when you eat the bread and it's accompanied by a lifton, by any sort of accompaniment or condiment, then you eat it quicker. So again, Rashi's learning that the Mishnah is being machmir by whittling down the time period of shehiyah, and after that short amount of time, the begadim that he's wearing on his body contract tumah, and they become a rishon l'tumah. All that we learn from one word, according to Rav Chanin, and that's the word chita. What do we learn from the word sa'ora?
Wait, I just one question. To learn measurements from the word chita.
In other words,
it has nothing to do with eating the bread. Well, it has to do with the tumah.
No, it's not. It has nothing to do with eating the bread at all. It has to do with the time period that it takes to eat the bread, not about eating the bread. So when the Torah gives you the word chita to describe the beautiful shvach of Eretz Yisrael, it's giving you a shear for Tumas Beis HaMenuga of
So
what's called Kidei Achilas Pras. Right, it's only shehir. Even though the Torah says, again, if we read the pasuk literally, the Torah says, "Ve'ochel b'bayis yichabes es begad." But Chazal understood it to mean the amount of time it would take to eat that seuda, which is called Achilas Pras. And we'll see this over and over again.
But that's an example of Urim being in the Torah, not Moshe Rabbeinu.
That's what the Gemara is claiming, and the Gemara is going to backtrack. The Gemara is going to accept your view, but right now the Gemara in the Havmina thinks this is called Doraisa. Sa'ora, what do we derive from the word Sa'ora? A kernel of barley. Isnan, we learned in the Mishnah in the second paragraph of Olos, and the Mishnah is talking about what's called atzomos, which means that we don't have the corpse itself with its flesh, we have just its bones. And the question is, if a person comes in contact with the bone of a deceased, or he carries the bone of a deceased, how large of a bone is it in order to contract tumas mes? Etzem kisiora, a bone that's small, and it's so small, it's equal to the kernel of a barley. And it's metame b'maga umasa ve'ena metame b'oah. Okay, let's explain. There's a tumah called ohel. Tumas ohel means that if a person or vessels are inside a house or a tent, and there's a corpse inside the tent, then the Adam and Kalim become what's called an Alpha Tumah. That's called Tumas Ohel. However, the bones of a corpse do not convey Tumas Ohel. You can have bones inside an Ohel, and a person enters into the Ohel, he does not become Tameh unless one of the following four conditions are met. Number one, you have a complete spinal column, that's called a Shidra. Or number two, you have a complete skull, just the bones, no flesh. Or you have the majority of the limbs of a human being, which is called 125 limbs. Or you have what's called Rov Binyan Aguf, means you have the upper part of the legs plus one lower part of the leg. That's called Rov Binyan Aguf. In all those cases, if you enter into the Ohel, you contract tumas mes. However, if you don't have any of those conditions, you just have an etzem kisa'ora, you do not contract tumas mes by entering into the house. Now, you and I may think that this is very irrelevant, this is very theoretical, but the truth is, and that's the tragedy of it, if you talk to people, who are called oskim be chesed shel emes, and they never have to go into certain places where they look for every single body part or bones or whatever, and they bury them and so forth. This is very relevant, even in our time, because the Kohen is not allowed to contract tumah. And in Mir Tzem Yibana Beis HaMikdash, we're hoping that's going to happen in a very few days, so we don't have to fast this Sunday. Then he's not allowed to enter into the Beis HaMikdash once he contracts tumah. If he does so, he's chayiv kares. That's called the machne shechina. But if there's only a bone, then there's only what's called tumas maga umasa. How large of a bone does it have to be? Kisse or geffen? Oh, this is a little bit more complicated. What do we derive from geffen? Hidei revius yayin l'nosir. Right, a nosir is not allowed to enter into a beis hakvaros. He's not allowed to cut his hair, but he's also enjoined from any product of the grapes. And the Torah includes in that, number one, grapes. Number two, what's called zagim. Zagim are the outer coverings of the grapes, what we call klipos anovim. Next, we have something called chartzanim, and this is all explicit in Parshas Naso. Chartzanim are the pits inside the grapes. And finally, we have olim olulavim. Olim are the leaves on the grapevine, and lulavim are the, you have to help me here with the English here, the chutim. If you ever see a vine, you'll see that they have, like threads, so to speak, which are very soft. And according to one opinion in the Gemara in Nazir, we're getting a little taste of Masechet Nazir. Hopefully, we won't get drunk on it. And that's on Daf Lamed Daled. The Gemara says that the sheer chiyuv of achila. Now, again, he's eating any of the zagim, chartzanim, olim, lulavim. He's eating them, and yet, according to one opinion, the sheer, how much does he have to eat in order to incur a violation of the Isur Nazir? It's a revius. Now, a revius is usually dedicated for what kind of measurement? Liquids, not for solids. But now he's eating solids. The classic, as we'll see in a minute, shear for solids is a kazayas. And yet here, according to one opinion in the Gemara Nazir, the shear of zagim, etc., which he's eating, is paradoxically the shear of revius. Revius is a revius lug yayin, let's say 4 ounces of liquid. And the Gemara discusses how do you measure a revius from a solid. And the Gemara says you have to fill up a cup of wine, kos malea yayin, and you get to the point where the yayin spills over. And now you put these things into the yayin, whether it's anovim or chartzanim, olim, olu, avig, fanim, and you see at what point is there a revius of yayin displaced. So this is the displacement theory. And that's how we're going to measure whether or not he in fact ate a revius yayin. If I hadn't learned this and I came into the shit and I said, ate a revius yayin, you'd laugh me out of it. What do you ate a revius yayin? A revius is a liquid measurement. But this is how we measure the... Now, why do we use a cup of wine and not a cup of water? So the Gemara explains that yayin is av visamich. It's very thick. And therefore, it takes a long time to displace yayin. Water is very thin. As soon as you put something in the water, immediately the water spills over. So you would have a chumrah if you use if you use mayin, water, to measure a revius. And the kula here is that we measure revius with a kos of yayin, which is av, and an oveh. And as a result, until you get to a revius, you're going to have to put a lot of zagim and lovim into the kos yayin. Then we get to te'ena. Te'ena is literally a fig, higrogeres, and that's a dried fig. Lotzah Shabbos, the halacha is, one of the 39 halachas, of course, on Shabbos is Hotzah, which means you took an object from one Rishus, or Rishus HaYachid, into Rishus HaRabim, or vice versa. Or you carried an object 4 amos in Rishus HaRabim. And the question is, how much of an object? What is the minimum size of an object to incur? In this case, a chiv skila, if you did it b'mezid, or chatos, if you did it b'shogeg, for meleches Hotzah. And in general, the rule is that every object has to be determined on its own. And the Gemara talks about, for example, let's say you carried a hoe, H-O-E. So is this hoe functional? And you will look at the size of the hoe and decide whether it's functional. But when it comes to food stuff, if he's carrying food stuff, then there's a uniform absolute shear, which is called kigrogeres, like a dried fig. And that's true for all food stuff. Then we go on in the pasuk, rimon, disnan, and now what shear are we going to derive from the word rimon? And now we're learning about taras kalim. What does that mean? I have a utensil and a contracted tumah. That state of tumah is dependent upon what's called the shem kalim. If at some point the keli breaks, this is what we call in Kabbalah shviras kalim, right? So at that point, the tumah just completely evaporates into thin air. But the question is, at what point is the kli considered broken, meaning non-functional? And here we differentiate between what's called a balabayis and an uman. Balabayis is, excuse me, is a person who's not interested in selling his kelim. It's only functional. He buys them. And the Balabayas tends to be, again, don't take this in the wrong way, tends to be a little more stingy, meaning it's not so easy and ready to throw out a vessel, as long as it still has some bare function. So, for example, let's say this vessel was punctured the size of what's called a kitness. Kitness is what would you call it in English? A bean, very small bean. So you know what? He's not going to use it for water. He'll hold on to the kli. He'll use it for what? For olives. Now it breaks and it's got a hole the size of an olive. He can't use it for olives anymore. It's going to fall through the hole. But he uses it for a rimon, for a pomegranate, which is a much larger kli. Once he gets to the point that the hole is so large that it's a rimon will fall through the hole, he chucks it. And that means it's no longer got a shem kli and it's no longer tum. Then we have an uman. An uman is going to sell his vessels on the market. The moment it gets a little opening, a shever that is the size of a kitness, right, a little bean, it's no longer makabel tumah. This is fascinating because it means the status of the kli is relative to the owner of the kli. And there are many halachas in tumas kelim that depend upon the owner. For example, what his machshava is. Let's say during the manufacturing process, did he intend to do a gemar malacha? Did he not? All these are kovea tumah v'tar. So this is derived from the word rimon. We move on. Eretz, zeis, shemen. Take out the word dvash. And now we're talking about the shear of kezayis. And Rav Chanin makes a very radical, kind of eloquent, dramatic statement. He says, Eretz shekol shiureh kezayis. And as if to say all the shiurim are kezesim. So the Gemara says, what do you mean kol shiurim al ketaitiv? You can't tell me he means literally all the shiurim are ika ani damara damrina. We just had a whole list of shiurim, of chita, of siora, of gefen, te'ena, rimon, and that they don't have the shiur of kezais. Ela ema rov shiureh kezesim. That as a general rule in most areas of halacha, the shiur is kezais. So for example, Rashi gives a number of examples here. The shear of tumas basar ames. Until now, we're talking about atzamos, the bones, but the flesh of a body of a corpse will be able to transmit tumah if you have a kezayis min ames, or for example, nevela. Nevela also will convey tumah under certain circumstances, and possibly even if you swallow it without touching it, and that's called a kezayis. Achilas nevela in general is a kezayis, a behemoth tmeya. Let's say you eat bacon, chas v'shalom, so you chayv for a kezayis to get 39 lashes. Chelev, dam, pigul, nosar. These are all chayve krisus, and the shear is a kezayis. Okay, fine. Rov shiuri Torah are kezayis. And again, you could see how Rav Chanan is really interested in shvach Eretz Yisrael. That the zayis in the Eretz Zeis is indicative of most of the shiur. Then we get to dvash. Now, to your surprise and mine, dvash is not what you think it is. Don't judge a honey by its cover, because we're not talking about honey. We're talking about a date. And what kind of date are we talking about? Kikoseves hagasa, which is a very large date. And that shear is the shear of Yom Kippur. And this is something that we discussed at the end of Masechet Yoma, that the minimum shear to incur a chiyuv kares, when the Torah says ki kol hanefesh shelo seuna b'etzem hayom hazeh v'nichrasa me'amea, is a koseves agasa. And you might ask the question, why isn't it a kezayis like all the other shiurim that we listed? And the answer is because the chiyuv of eating on Yom Kippur is not formulated as achila. It's not the achila that's prohibited, but rather the hafkas inui, meaning the Torah says you have to be in a state of affliction. And it's not enough to eat a kezayis. You're still feeling very, very hungry and pains in your stomach until you eat a koseves agasa, which is a larger shear than what? Than a kezayis. So that's as far as Yom Kippur is concerned. Now, Mendel, this is your point. The Torah says, Almado Raisen Inu. How can you tell me the name of Rav that all shiurim are halacha l'moshe b'sinah? These are all in the Torah. So he turns the question back to him. He throws it back in his court. V'tizbra shiurim ksivi.
What they just did in the Gemara, all the Sheva Minim, they were bringing rices or Gemaras.
Right, different Mishnayos.
So that's not called Torah.
Right now, the Gemara thinks that that's Torah.
So that's called Deraisa, what they just
right. And now the Gemara rejects it. I was hoping you would wait until the rejection, because then maybe you'll feel more comfortable. V'tizbara. V'tizbara means, what are you thinking? Shiurim miksivi? Where does it say shiurim in this pasuk? That you can tell me you derive shiurim from the Torah. No. Do you see one pasuk? For example, does the pasuk of Chita, in describing the Peres Vetzil, mention Beis HaMenuga? Does the pasuk of Rimon in Shevach mention a word about a Tumas Keli when the Keli broke? Ella Hilchas Aminu. All these shiurim halacha Moshe Sinai. And Rav Chanan never meant to say that they were Doraisa. Ukra asmachta bi'almahu. That sometimes what the Chacham want to do is they want to show you that although we have an oral tradition, but there is some sort of a source, like a little bit of a root, a shorish that you can find in Torah Shebechsav. And this has to do with the relationship between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. That everything in Torah Shebal Peh can find its source in Torah Shebechsav.
When it says Torah Shebal Peh, means
not always. No, in this context, it means halacha Moshe Sinai. Torah Shebal Peh means a lot more than just halacha Moshe Sinai. Like, for example, I don't know if I can do this, but theoretically, if I came up with a Kal V'chomer, that would be Torah Shebal Peh, but it's not halacha Moshe Sinai. There is one statement in Chazal that anything that a Talmud will ever come up with, Moshe Rabbeinu heard it in Sinai, but that's not halacha Moshe Sinai.
There's no source in the Torah?
It's not explicit in the Torah, correct. Like, for example, I gave you the example before of Arla and Chutznos. The opening line in the Parsha of Arla, which is in Vayikra Perek Yutes, says, Ki savo al artzacha. It specifically says Eretz Yisrael. And yet the halacha Moshe Sinai tells me that if I'm in Brooklyn, New York, I have an Isur Arla for the first 3 years. And if I violate that Isur Chas v'Shalom, I violated Doraisa, because halacha Moshe Sinai is a Doraisa. It's not as Chomer, it's not as strict as a Doraisa Mamish, but it does have the status of a Doraisa. Although, don't ask me Kash, because Suffolk Orla Skutzorts is mutter, but that's a different halacha. All right, now if you remember, Rav had 3 categories. He had Shiurim, and then he had Chatzitzim. Right? Chatzitza means if a guy goes down to the mikveh and he's wearing something on his body that separates the water from his body, then the tefillah is not worth a dime. So the Gemara says, Doraisa ninu. That's not halacha Moshe Sinai. The Torah says with regard to Mitzorah, Virachatz es bisaro. I think you have to read the parentheses in this case. B'mayim v'taher. And it says bisaro b'mayim. What does it mean, bisaro b'mayim? It means that his basar, his flesh, comes in contact with the water. Shelo yedavar chotzitz beino levein hamayim. So we see clearly that chatzitza is doraisa. How could Rav make a statement that it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai? And Rabbosai here in this case, we're not going to say it's an asmachta, because here it's explicit in the Torah. So if somebody comes to me and says to me, well, Rabbi, I found that I had something on my body when I came up from the mikveh, but, it's only halacha Moshe Sinai. What are you talking about? It's not halacha Moshe Sinai. This is Doraisa, because the Torah says, Bisara b'mayim. So the Gemara says, you know what? Rav had in mind something else. Not a classic chatzitza, but a hair, H-A-I-R. V'chiasoi hilchasa l'sa'ara. That chatzitza will passel his tefillah and completely negate the value of his immersion. Why? Even if he has a problem with his hair. What does that mean with his hair? He's got knots in his hair. The Rabba Bar Chana, the Omar Rabba Bar Chana, a person jumps into the mikvah, the Nema Achas Kshura. He has one hair that's tied in a knot. Okay, now wait a minute. This is not clearly a chatzitza. A knot in a hair? Does that mean that the water didn't come in contact with his flesh just because he had a knot in his hair? And we're talking about a case of what's called makpid. Rashi says makpid means he doesn't want a knot in his hair. Some people couldn't care less if they have a knot in his hair. He does not want a knot in his hair, so he's makpid. And chotzetzes. He has to do another tefillah. His tefillah is completely null and void. However,
not talking about his head. Attached to his head.
It's attached to his head.
Then we're supposed to cut all your hair off? You go to the mikveh?
Well, what I would recommend is one of two things. Either don't be makpid. So you have a knot in your hair. Okay, let it go by. You know what I'm saying? You won't, as we say in Yiddish, starbenished. You won't die from it.
Oh, it's not in the hair.
A knot in his hair. Okay, we'll see about the Rabbanans. Now we're talking about the Oraisis, right? So, Shalosh, Einom Chotzitzos. Very fascinating. If he's got 3 hairs that are tied together in a knot, that's not a chatzitza. Why? Because 3 hairs already is a looser knot. I mean, you really have to be very nuanced and sensitive to this. So the water will be able to get through to his body. Shtayim, says Rabbah, Eini Odeh. I don't know the law if you have 2 hairs that are tied together. So the Gemara answers, wait a second. What are you talking about? Si'aro nami doraisinin. You're telling me that when the Torah says that there's a law of chatzitza, it doesn't refer to a seir, to a hair. Now, this is based on a methodology that darshinan esid, and S always comes as a ribu. S hatafel b'sara. Not only is there a problem if the water does not immediately touch his basar, but even if it is blocked by something that's tafel b'sara. And what is tafel b'sara? Like an addendum to his hair and to his body. That's the seir. The seir is like an addition, a tag on it, an attachment to it. So the Gemara answers, Ki asoi hilchasa likir Rebbe Yitzchak. The reason why we need halacha Moshe Sinai is not